Hello, Harold Pollack. How are you doing?
Doing really well. Nice to talk to you again, Glenn.
Yeah, it's very good to be with you. This is Glenn Loury of Brown University and the Glenn Show at Blogging Heads, and I'm talking with Harold Pollack, professor at the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. And Harold and I are old friends, and we've been on here talking about various issues over the years here at Blogging Heads. And in this election season, where the fur has begun to fly, it seemed like an appropriate time for us to check in with each other. Me from my somewhat curmudgeonly and contrarian centrist democratic perspective, if you'll allow me that, and Harold from his flamingly liberal left-wing uh, democratic advocate of social change perspective. See if we can find something that we can agree about, or at least amiably disagree about.
Yeah, no, it's quite an amazing year. I should say that I have probably described by most of my friends as a liberal technocrat, and I think actually that this election has actually made me realize that is in fact a accurate description of me. I'm very progressive, but I found no particular appeal in the Sanders approach because I'm just more of a wonk than the sort of Sanders folks were.
And you knew that much of what he was proposing wasn't really coherent or feasible.
Yeah. I thought he raised some very good points and pushed Clinton to the left on some issues. Sometimes I disagreed with him, sometimes I agreed with him. But yeah, it didn't, the sort of wonk aspect just wasn't there. And there's reasons for that, but anyway, I digress.
No, I was just going to offer that we're speaking today as a Thursday, and on Monday of this week, the first of the three presidential debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump took place. And I'm just wondering, Harold, there's been a lot of commentary back and forth about it, how you assessed that event, both in terms of the performance of the candidates, but also in terms of the likely impact of those performances on the course of the election.
A couple of things came to mind. First of all, I'm very happy that young people in America got to watch a woman, a not young woman, which is relevant, I think, to some of the stereotypes that are going on in this campaign, take on this sort of very formidable, bombastic alpha male when the stakes could hardly be higher and just clean his clock. I think that was a very valuable thing for people to see, that she was smarter than he was, tougher than he was, more prepared than he was, and she really clobbered him in one of the most lopsided debates that I've ever seen. It was just remarkable. It was remarkable that how good she was and how bad he was, in a way that I think he behaved actually the same way that he behaved in all the previous debates, but being one-on-one with a woman, and in an environment where he couldn't where the antics that he usually does just don't play well, he was really exposed in a profound way. It was, so I don't think it's the decisive event in this campaign, but it was, he took a real blow there. What did you think?
Well, I don't disagree with your assessment. I mean, I can hardly disagree with your assessment that she was cool, she was prepared, and she was tough. She really did show herself, acquit herself well under pressure. And he was bombastic, and he was wandering, and he was out of control, and seemed not to be able to either effectively defend himself or to, and he had plenty of opportunities to bring the battle to her by on the offense by bringing up issues on which where she would be exposed.
Yeah.
So by any objective measure, I think you would have to say that she got the better of him in the debate. Whether it was the most lopsided error, I don't know how to make that calculation, but she definitely, by my account, won the debate. However, and the however is, and I'm not the first person to make this observation, it's not at all clear that having done so will redound very much to her electoral benefit, in the sense that it's not yet, at least to me, clear that the ways in which she won the debate will be effective at moving voters who might not yet be decided about whom they want to support. I mean, I thought, and again, I'm not original to make this observation, that he did have going for him a couple of things, and I'll desist and hear what you have to say. He had this, look, you've been there for 30 years, and what have you done? Literally, she's done quite a bit. You could tick off the list of the things she's done. She served as senator, secretary of state, early advocate of health reform, prominent in various other social policy realms, so forth and so on. You could say that she's done a lot of things, but that she is the insider defending the incumbent party and the establishment political arrangements is clear. And in this election year, that does seem to be something that weighs slightly in the advantage of the person who's challenging from the outside. And also his sort of emotion. I mean, she was cool. She was clinical. Maybe she had to be. Maybe as a woman, anything that was a little bit more than a flat line would have seemed like emotional hysteria on television. And maybe that's something that she had to watch out for. She was definitely cool and clinical. And he was passionate. And again, for some people who are moved by this, that kind of passion might have played well. So, I've read many of the postmortems. Most of them come to the same conclusion that you and I have done on the objective merits. But in terms of assessing the electoral significance of her victory, there seems to be a range of opinion with some people thinking that it might not make that much of a difference. We'll have the thing I'll be interested in. Of course, I know you remember the first debate between Romney and Obama in 2012.
Yeah.
By wide assessment, the president lost that debate. He did not come off looking as strong as he would subsequently look. And so he made an adjustment. And I guess the question is whether or not we're going to see some kind of adjustment from Donald Trump, whether he's capable of, willing to, change up his game plan going into these debates in an effort of trying to be more effective.
You mentioned the Romney-Obama debate. The really important contrast that concerns me is actually not anything about how Obama changed his tactics and what Trump could do, but the reaction among the followers. So Obama just got clobbered in the first debate, and I went up to Milwaukee the Saturday after that debate to canvass for the Obama campaign. And I walk into this office in Milwaukee, and it's just overflowing with people. And there's every kind of person that is an Obama supporter there. There's LGBT people, there's union people, there's immigration people, there's a ton of African Americans, and everybody was like, wow, he could really lose this thing. We got to actually go out and do stuff.
We better get busy.
Yeah, and they got busy. And there were more people there than there were things to do. And it was, I get really insulted when people talk about how the Obama campaign used big data and all these techniques to prevail over Romney. The thing that Obama did was he had millions of people around the country who really, really, really wanted to see him reelected and were willing to go out and work hard to make that happen. And a lot of the commentary that I've seen about Hillary Clinton is people sitting passively saying, she did this, she should have done that, she should have, and whereas what are we doing? And, here we have a threat to the future of the country. Romney was someone I disagreed with. A lot of people would have lost their health insurance if he had won. It would have been devastated if Romney had won, but he would have been an acceptable president that you could hand the nuclear keys to, who obviously is a person of great substance and ability in a lot of ways, even if one disagreed with him. Here we have Trump, who is really represents a failure of the gatekeeping function of our two-party system in the most profound way, who's a grifting demagogue and a pathological liar with no impulse control, and we really have, et cetera. And we're all sitting back passively hoping that this woman in the arena is going to kick his butt and critiquing her performance.
Okay, so here's one of the things about Trump discourse. I'm inclined to say you're a little hyperbolic, and yet I don't really want to say that. Okay, audience, I'm not actually saying that. I'm saying that was an inclination. And the thing that cuts me short from saying it and then going, okay, pathological liar, okay. Hysterical demagogue, okay. Loose cannon is about to blow up the world. And then try to tick off why I think those things might be slightly overblown.
You left off grifter, by the way.
Oh, grifter, yeah, okay. Swindler, dishonest, money grubbing, racist. I mean, you didn't say that, but you might have. The thing that holds me back is I don't want to be thought of as the kind of person who would have anything that could even be interpreted as being supportive or good to say about Donald Trump. And therefore, the hyperbolic language comes out, and you can imagine the same kind of hyperbolic language on the other side of this debate from the Sean Hannity crowd about Hillary Clinton being a pathological this and a dangerous that and a unfit this, that, and the other, to which, of course, you or I would be ready to stand up and say, oh, no, I mean, come on, man. You might not have liked the way she handled Benghazi, or you might think that the Obama administration's policy vis-a-vis Russia in these various theaters hasn't been so effective or whatever. But saying that she's unfit to occupy the office, you might think her husband's dalliances are embarrassing to the country, but, reducing her to being, we would defend her. So what am I saying? I feel like Trump needs a little bit of defending from the way in which you just characterize him, but I'm not the guy who's prepared to offer the defense.
But one of the things that I am very proud of in my
let me just finish the thought. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm very sorry to interrupt. Because even though it seems unlikely, he might win. And because even though he might lose, there are scores of millions of people who think he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And therefore, especially in the perhaps unlikely but not impossible event that he should actually win, having this kind of characterization of him as completely unfit for the office and would not go unchallenged by what might have been the case that I would have offered if I were the kind of person willing to take that risk upon myself. I don't know. There's something that doesn't quite sit well with me about that. I mean, he really could end up being the president of the United States. And
well, that's why I think it's important to accurately describe the tremendous defects in his character and capabilities that would make it such a tragedy for that, would that event occur. Because I actually don't describe people randomly that way. I wouldn't describe Romney that way, and I didn't describe Romney that way in 2012. There is. I think the words that I used were severe, but were actually not hyperbolic if one looks at the actual behavior of Donald Trump, and it's
okay. You're trying to lure me into this conversation that I don't want to have, in which we actually look at his behavior, and I say it's not as bad as you say it is. And since we're not having that conversation, let's move on to something else.
We can brag. Fair enough.
But in any case, we have debate 1 that's down. It's in the book now, and debates 2 and 3 coming up. And the campaign is still very close, Harold.
It's very close.
I'd be interested to know what the fundraising numbers look like for these candidates in these early days after the debate. And Trump doesn't have much of a ground organization of the sort that you were talking about for Obama in 2012, but he does have a fundraising operation that's pretty extensive, and I'd like to know how people on that side of the aisle are responding to what clearly was a setback for him on Monday.
That's a very good question, and I do think, by the way, one of the most important effects was just on morale. Hillary Clinton had a bad several weeks, and people were just very down and critiquing her, and she was a very formidable debater. What happened on Monday was her best case, but it was hardly super surprising. But people hadn't seen her being so formidable in a while. And
she looked good too, Harold, if I may say so. I mean, she looked strong. She looked healthy. She looked, she did not look haggard. She did not seem to be, what did he say? Lack stamina? Well, no. In fact, quite the other way around. It was he who seemed to wilt a little bit under the lights after an hour or so.
If God has a sense of humor, Trump will develop walking pneumonia. It was actually, that's right. But I do think one of the bad things about having such and I'll continue I say this in an analytical sense, having such a loathsome candidate on one side makes it impossible to discuss some things that are actually quite important. For example, you have 2 70-year-old people running for president. it actually strikes me as a very good general practice that each of them have some sort of a medical exam that's done in a judicious way, and the public has some information. How healthy is this person to assume this incredible burden? Now, the fact is, I would vote for, Hillary Clinton in a coma is a better president than Donald Trump healthy. So, there's no...
Says Harold Pollack.
Yes, absolutely. But so it sort of makes it's a moot point now. But I did write some very harsh things about McCain in 2008 when he appointed Sarah Palin, where I said, hey, let's get real. The guy's 70. He should appoint someone to be vice president who can assume the office if he's not able to do it. And there are certain realities of human life that we should address.
White male at age 70 has a life expectancy of what, 15 years, 17 years, something like that?
Well, first of all, being dead is a fairly stringent clinical outcome measure for what we don't want to have happen. There's a lot of health issues that older people have, and it seems to me that I would like to see some sort of a general norm that is taken away.
I don't like the age discrimination thing that you're doing. If you're 70, we need to know, we have to have a public doctor examine you. But if you're 45, we don't have to have a public doctor figure out whether you've got prostate cancer or something.
Okay, well, everybody should. Okay, I would make it not age specific, but it's just a reality that at age 70, people are more vulnerable. And the idea, the stupidity. His doctor, by the way, looks like somebody that was like the pill doctor who was trailing along with the Grateful Dead. The letter that Trump's doctor wrote was so hilarious at one level. Oh, he said he was the most awesomely healthy candidate. So something like awesome in its accent said he's the most healthy presidential candidate, of all time. And you sort of see a picture of Obama side by side with Trump, and it's possibly not true. And at one level, it was kind of hilarious.
20 years difference in their ages, 15, at least 15.
Yeah,
and Trump's a little overweight. Obama's very fit, maybe even a little bit on the Rayleigh side. Yeah, okay, that's a hyperbolic statement. Trump's the most healthy candidate we've ever seen.
But it also just shows how there's no sense of decorum or professionalism about just how do we go about properly vetting people.
But wait a minute, Harold. Didn't Hillary Clinton have a concussive event not that long ago? Did we not see her publicly collapse under? Or, it didn't look at all good. The videos that I saw, there's nothing like that in Trump's case that would cause us to have that alone.
No, I'm just saying that we should be able to talk about this stuff in an open way, and it's hard to do in this campaign season because the stakes are so high. But we need to deal with this in a more sensible way moving forward. Because I do think, like when Hillary Clinton had this walking pneumonia, I think it was a fair question to say, hey, what's going on and how healthy is she? And to me, that's a legitimate issue. And it's hard. It's easy to forget that because we're talking about the apocalypse here, but it's actually a legitimate issue.
Okay, all right, my left-wing wonkish friend. You work on issues of race and policing and violent crime and so on. Your city, Chicago, has been a site of much discussion about these things. What did you make of the candidates' response, both of them, to Lester Holt's question about what would they do to improve race relations in the country?
Well, I think we do have some issues. There's been an uptick in crime. We're still way better than we were 20 years ago as a nation, but we've had an uptick, and we've got some issues to deal with. There's nothing that we're experiencing in Chicago that is not happening in St. Louis, Cleveland, Buffalo, Baltimore. But we got some challenges. And
are you saying that the shootings are as frequent, normalized to population in these other cities as they are in Chicago, which has gotten a lot of press because of the shootings?
Yeah, we're pretty much in the middle of the pack for Rust Belt cities. We're really not an outlier, but we're a lot more dangerous than Los Angeles or New York City, and that's why we get so much of the negative press that we do. And we're certainly much safer than we were 20, 25 years ago in Chicago. But we've got a real problem.
And everywhere else, for that matter, than 25 years ago, right? I mean, crime is down across the board. Violent crime is down across the board. But we do have the uptick. I want to ask you whether you think this Ferguson effect argument has anything to do with that. And we do have a large number. I mean, what is the number of shootings in Chicago so far this year? It's a large number.
Yeah.
And they keep talking about this nearly 4,000 murders since the president was inaugurated in 2009. That strikes me as a lot of dead people. So you're saying there's no difference about Chicago relative to the other Midwestern cities?
Well, by the way, this business of the deaths since Obama's been president, if you did the same thing for George W. Bush, you would have actually seen more. I mean, it's sort of, there's nothing holding President
Chicago's
Obama.
not his hometown, I think, is the point. I think the point is he got elected president in part coming from the land of Lincoln and coming off the south side of Chicago. And you might think he would want to address himself to a tragedy unfolding in his own city.
Which he's trying to do. And one of the things that I think is really important is to maintain a sense of evidence-based optimism in attacking this problem, because I think everybody's sad about this problem, but it becomes an occasion to either become very to lose a sense of agency and efficacy about it, to say, and there's a liberal version and a conservative version of this. Sort of the liberal version is, we got so many guns out there because we've screwed up our national gun policies and we've got so much poverty and segregation that basically there's nothing we can do until we address the root causes. And that's a recipe for real passivity that's very harmful. There's also, of course, a conservative version, which is all we have to do is get rid of all the negative messages in popular culture and all the single parenthood, and then we're good. And both of these things are sort of the year 2100 plan. And I think it's really important to understand that there's things happening on the ground in Chicago and other places that have successfully reduced violence, and that we can push harder on to be effective. And I've certainly, you've heard me talk about the Becoming a Man intervention, which I'm involved in, and which reduced arrests for violent offenses by more than 40% among the participants. We've also seen with summer jobs.
Let me just stop you right there. I want to understand it. So this is a mentoring intervention?
It's a once-a-week group counseling intervention with a kind of mentoring component that's school-based, and it was done in, it's being done in dozens of the toughest schools in Chicago at scale in the real-world environment. Becoming a Man. Yeah. And we did a randomized trial. Okay, we really did it right. And one of the things that's really striking is when you do that and you show people you can move the needle. President Obama's been quite involved in it, Mayor Emanuel, a lot of funders. People are hungry for things that work. And the same, by the way, Sarah Heller was the lead author. Actually, she's the sole author in an article in Science on the One Summer Chicago jobs youth employment, which also showed large reductions in arrests for violent offending among the participants. So there's things that we can do that don't involve putting cuffs on people.
Okay, so these programs have not yet been taken to scale in Chicago? That's a question. You have experimental results that show effectiveness, but you still have large numbers of people getting shot. So they've yet to be implemented, and what's the impediment to doing so?
Well, they're scaling up. I mean, they're being done on a not trivial scale, but they need to be done on a broader scale. One of the problems that we have is that these are very, even these are done in a way that is very cost effective, and they're pretty stripped down interventions financially in terms of the cost, but it's still costly. And, it's striking to me how often we say, what has Mayor Emanuel done to reduce the violence, as if big city mayors can push all the levers. We have these national failures of youth employment, of housing policy, all these things going on. And within our checkerboard political economy, the resources available to address these things at the required scale is often limited, in local government. And so there's things that are happening that we need to be more aggressive. I think we could use a little help from Springfield and Washington to really do these things, more seriously. We have no state budget, for example, in Illinois at the moment. So a lot of social service agencies are either closing or have dramatically reduced what they can offer people. And so some of the preventive things that we do are really being damaged by things that are, by these types of problems.
Okay.
I gave you a whole mouthful. I'm sorry. I'll let you focus us back.
No, that's okay. You're making the point, as I understand it, that there are effective anti-gun violence interventions that have been shown to work in Chicago, and that and moreover that the overall level of violence, while it's alarming, is much lower than it has been in the not too distant past. And we should be careful not to either lose hope that there's anything to be done or to overstate the extent of the problem. I think these are points worth making.
Well stated.
You said violence uptick. Now, Heather McDonald is out there. I mean, she ain't going away. This is the writer for the City Journal, Manhattan Institute critic and social observer who has been pronouncing the ill effects of Black Lives Matter's anti-police rhetoric and the so-called war on cops that she has declared that there is a war on cops, she says. And she says police are pulling back. I think I read somewhere that your mayor, Rahm Emanuel, had referred to the Chicago police as being in a fetal position. Did I not see that somewhere, or am I imagining that? Did he not make a remark of that kind? And if so, is it an accurate characterization of what's going on in Chicago? And does it have anything to do with the uptick in violence there?
Well, let me answer it this way. Public safety is the joint product of the police and the community. And we've had a very, very serious loss of police legitimacy that's been building for a long time, and that really was brought home by things like the Laquan McDonald shooting. And it wasn't the shooting itself, bad as that was. It was the fact that all these officers who were doing the right thing and watched an officer kill this kid in the obviously horribly unjustified fashion, still circled the wagons behind him and supported him. And people could see the police report, and they could see the cell phone videos, and see that there was just that lots of people had signed on to a lie, and that type of thing had a tremendous effect. Now, I do think that we want police officers to be proactive, and that they're both very angry, and they're also very risk averse and fearful about what happens if I stop somebody and I go to question this person under ambiguous circumstances, something bad happens. I see a lot of downside for me, and I don't see a lot of upside for me. So I think I'm going to be more passive and answer 911 calls, but not quite go out there and do the way that the way that ideally I might. I do think that's a problem. We do have we want police to be aggressive, but they have to be aggressive in a way that the community accepts. And we got some real work to do. It's going to take us years to come out of this. It's interesting. Dwayne Wade's cousin was murdered, and the perpetrator was very quickly caught on the South Side. The perpetrators. Yeah,
they were brothers, right?
Yeah, and it was interesting, and everybody on every side looked at this case and has used it as a talking point. From the police perspective, in a way that I totally get from a human perspective, the police were saying, if we had this cooperation with every murder, this is how we could solve them. People in the community basically gave us a ton of information about who these people were and how we could get them. And people in the community were saying, we absolutely understood that every level of required resources was going to be brought to bear to solve this. This was an atrocity that everyone took seriously. I didn't have to be scared of witness intimidation because we have a big problem with that. And so of course, if you put all these elements together, of course we were able to cooperate more effectively with the police than we could otherwise do. And I think it's going to take us a very long time. I think that probably I'm hoping that in some ways the police union folks and the most strident Black Lives Matter folks they dominate the oxygen in the public debate. There's an awful lot of people that are ambivalent that are somehow in the middle of those two perspectives who are really going to decide what happens here. And Because we do need the police, and and the community needs to have the police reform some of their worst practices.
Well, wait a minute. Now, I read the much discussed list of demands that were put out by a consortium of Black Lives Matter affiliated groups. Mm-hmm. And I don't recall anything in there that said we need the police. And I don't recall reading anything about exhorting communities to cooperate with police and bringing criminals who prey upon them to justice. In fact, if I had seen a Stop Snitching manifesto appended to that list of demands, I wouldn't have been the least bit surprised, because it would have been in the same tone of voice as much of what it is that I saw there about policing. So if the police union ideology of circling the wagons, our guys can do no wrong, it's a tough job and get behind us, needs to be countered, doesn't the ideology of the cops are an invading army and an occupying army, the only point of prisons is to oppress black people, and you should have contempt, not respect, for the people who are trying to maintain order in your midst, doesn't that also need to be repudiated? I mean, not simply balanced off against something, but in fact called out for the inaccurate and unhelpful frame of mind about maintaining public safety. You say it's a joint product. We have a stake in the police cooperating with communities to produce public safety. Public safety is a good thing. Disorder actually reduces the quality of life. People in a community who commit violent acts are actually not the friends of the law-abiding people in the community, but they are rather people who are bringing down their quality of life. Why can't Black Lives Matter say that? I don't understand why Black Lives Matter is inconsistent, that theme, that frame of advocacy is inconsistent with affirming a cooperative role between police, broadly understood, and the residents of these communities.
Well, a couple of responses to that. One is, I think Black Lives Matter is a sprawling grassroots coalition of different groups and people. And it's one of the complexities of this is there's no one voice and there's no one home address that one can pick. If you look at something like the Campaign Zero document, which was put together by some people affiliated with Black Lives Matter, there are elements in there that are very similar to what urban public managers have been talking about for a long time. You know, we need to reform the collective bargaining agreements that police have to bring greater accountability when there's misconduct. We need greater training for police interventions with people in behavioral crises, things like that are actually the kinds of demands that fit within a frame of.
Those are demands on police. What about countering the Stop Snitching ideology within the community?
Well, let me say that I do think what's lacking in a lot of this is here's the positive policing vision that we want to see, and here's some things that here's some police that we admire in the way they go about their job, and we want to go and do that likewise. There's not enough of that. I think that it is. I have certainly challenged some of the BLM folks to do more, not so much to on the Stop Snitching thing, which that type of thing, but to show humanity towards the burdens that police have. I thought after the response by some people in BLM to the Dallas shootings seemed very begrudging and calculated, as opposed to embracing in a human way. And
we've talked about that here at Blogging Heads, you and I, in the past with people.
And I do think that. It is you have a leadership of young, you have a movement that's young, angry people. And it is, we're expecting an awful lot that they hit every note right. I do think that it is, I think police have to take the first step here because they are the ones that represent the power of the state. And because there's some very concrete things that police have to do to clean their house. And I think it's happening, by the way. There's things that we've been going on a long time. I think that I do think there are people in the community. I mean, you just look at someone like Father Flager, for example, and you look at the kinds of things where he's calling out gang members. He's leading his parishioners on a march through the south side of Chicago, and he's calling out by name the gang members that they're passing. There's an awful lot of stuff like that happening. I'm not sure if I'm addressing your
No,
question.
you are.
But
You are, but let me take you back a little bit because I started asking, how did Clinton and Trump handle the question during the first
oh yeah,
debate about improving race relations? And Clinton made reference to systematic bias of one kind or another. And she made some statements that I didn't think were true about how at every level of the criminal justice system, blacks are subject to more severe treatment for committing the same crimes and things like that. And that really is not my impression of the literature that tries to account for disparity in incarceration rates. I mean, there are some issues of bias, but rather, systemic longer sentences for the same crime. Not if you take into account past criminal records when you're trying to estimate sentencing, things like that. I thought she was a little bit over the top there. And Trump came out with Law and Order, which has offended a lot of people. Law and Order is a response to improving race relations. People have argued that that's impossible. And he came out for stop and frisk offending, which is also stop and frisk policing, which has also offended a lot of people. So I'm just wondering what you make both of Secretary Clinton's widespread systemic racial bias in the criminal justice system claim, which, as I say, I think is an overstatement, and also of Trump's I'll keep you safe, I'll fix it, don't worry about it, we're going to make the crime go away because Giuliani did it in New York City.
well, I'd say that if we get to the bias question, I think there's two realities that are both true and both have to be acknowledged. One is that there's a higher rate of offending among young, particularly African American men, and a higher rate of victimization.
Vastly higher. Excuse me for interrupting, but it's an order of magnitude higher.
And there's no question that if you look at homicide, for example, that young African American men in Chicago account for the great majority of both the offenders and the victims of our gun homicide problem. One certainly has to openly acknowledge that, and that it is, by the way, within the communities that I work, it is an obsession that everyone is always talking about. You go into any church, any community group, anything, and people are obsessed with what do we do about this, because everyone is affected and everybody's got a family member or someone who's been touched by this. There's no question that there is also bias, and that it is, it shows up in a variety of ways, and that is something that needs to be addressed. I think the real bias, though, is not in the way the criminal justice system deals with a particular offender. It's the fact that we have a community that's in pain, that is suffering so many problems that reinforce the violence, and the lever that we use to deal with it is the criminal justice lever. And you look at a community like Englewood, where everyone who owns a home there got wiped out. Their home equity was wiped out in the Great Recession, not dealt with effectively. High levels of youth unemployment, not dealt with effectively. High levels of mental health and other kinds of problems, not dealt with effectively. And then the only lever that we really are applying, with gusto, is the criminal justice lever. I cannot believe that if another community faced that same level of human pain, that we would respond to this. I mean, obviously, if you look, for example, at the drug problem in the African American community and the prescription opioid problem in white communities, the social response has been quite different. And it seems to me that race and class are matter a lot in that.
I want to push back a little bit. Of course, race and class matter. On the other hand, the Great Recession hit everybody. An effective response to the Great Recession, or an effective response to inadequate health care, or an effective response to the needs for drug and alcohol treatment, or whatever it might be, I don't understand that to be a community-specific racial issue. I understand that to be a general issue of American social policy. I should think that in the corners of society from which this guy J.D. Vance emerged, the author of Hillbilly Elegy, who talks about the so-called white underclass, or the communities that Robert Putnam or Charles Murray have called attention to in their respective books, Our Kids and Coming Apart, both of which examine difficulties in the lower middle classes of America and are concerned not only about communities of color, but also about whites, or the people that that Angus Deaton is calling attention to in his demographic work, which documents a decreasing life expectancy and a higher incidence of mortality and morbidity, suicide and opioid addiction and so forth, substantially amongst the lower middle class and working class whites. All of those people are, so the question is bias. I'm sorry, let me just be clear what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is the framing, the meme, the narrative bias, racial bias, anti-blackness, a contempt for the value of black people, an appropriate way of trying to understand what could otherwise be looked at as a general deficiency in the social provision, the security of the safety net, the ability of the state to respond to its people's needs. I mean, you say they wouldn't have responded in the same way. There was a crack epidemic in the black community. There's an opioid epidemic in the white. And the responses are really different. Well, I don't know. I mean, I want to see that looked at very carefully to figure out whether or not that's the case. You say that the only response is a punitive response. Well, yeah, the only response to people with guns shooting up the community is a punitive response. But I wouldn't think that the only response to the general social needs of those populations is punitive, or to the extent that it is, that's a failure to respond to the society as a whole and not just to black. So I'm questioning whether or not bias is right, whether Secretary Clinton was accurate in her response that the way that we're going to deal with improving race relations is to eliminate bias, which she imputed more or less universally to everybody. I mean, again, correct me if you think I'm saying something that's wrong.
Well, let me respond to a couple of things. One is on the specific opioid issue. So I did a lot of public health work around the HIV epidemic among people who inject drugs. And it was always the case that a couple percent of street users a year would die of overdose. And it was just, it was often the case that more people were dying of overdose than were dying of HIV in the heroin injecting population, which was an inner city population largely, and was certainly a poor people population. And there was not, and there was a public passivity, lack of concern, lack of provision of services, lack of attention, culture war framed to that until it really got out in the suburbs. All of us that have been involved in these issues for years, we watched the conversation change in a way that that just is like a punch in the gut, because anybody who's been doing this work for a long time, you knew that people were dying all along, and you can just see that the response now is much more compassionate, much more how do we expand treatment, how do we do what needs to be done, much less if people are committing slow suicide by heroin and there's not much we can do about it, sort of Bill Bennett type thing.
Can I interrupt just for a minute to ask you this? Would you allow that we might have learned from historical experience, and that therefore the treatment of current day problems is improved in part by the experience of the failures to react adequately in the past, which would be a different account than saying that because the subjects are more white today than yesterday, we care more about them?
There's something to that. Now, I'll grant that. I do think that there's a more humane, I think American society has become more humane. And in fact, I think a lot of the culture war things that we fought about 20 years ago, the culture war kind of quietly ended towards needle exchange and a lot of these issues. I think on the issue of bias, I would say, I guess I'd make almost a Loury-like point. I think where you're more right than Hillary Clinton is that we need to think about this in a more structural way. And see, what I find about the point that I was thinking about with the bias in the criminal justice system or the foreclosure crisis is that there's a political construction of public problems. And things that happen that affect organized, powerful constituencies, that's a crisis. So we had a foreclosure crisis in America because banks, middle-class people, the overall economy was tanking. We implement TARP, we implement a number of things, and people like you and I and the financial system, in many ways, the key pillars of American society recover. And the stock market doubles. South side of Chicago, people don't recover. There's 4 empty houses on my street, as I've told you. all over. If you look at all the top 10 zip codes in Chicago that have the highest foreclosure rate, almost all of them have more than 85% African American concentration or higher. It is not a crisis in terms of the American political system that these communities have been hammered and their wealth has been lost. And it's because of organization, power, and race is in there, but in a more complicated, more structural way. And the crisis. The problem is not touching an essential nerve in the American body politic in the way that it would if low-income African Americans were more influential. And I think, by the way, the opposite.
Harold, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I just want to stress this thing. Surely you know that we can find many white communities in which a similar devastation in terms of the value of property has occurred. So again, I just want to say we don't have to frame it as a racial issue or interpret the failure to respond as somehow a reflection of bias, since there are whites who are also being adversely affected.
Well, I think one of the you rightly point out that there's a class dimension to this.
That's what I'm saying.
And I do think that one thing that I've become more convinced of over time is that the top 20% of America is doing pretty well, and in some ways is moving away from the rest of the society in terms of many things. And we would much rather focus on the top 1% and talk about, read the real estate section of the Times and say, look at those people, they should be paying higher taxes.
Right.
And we avoid these class issues that go, housing segregation by definition does not involve the top 1%. It's a much, if they segregate themselves in limit, Boca Raton, it doesn't matter.
I want to underscore something that you're saying, which I think is very important. We have an inequality problem in this country. The politically easiest way to talk about it is to say there's a bunch of fat cats and bankers somewhere with $1 gazillion, and it's them against the rest of us, the 1% against the 99%. But the reality, where all the action is in the closer to the middle in the upper part of the distribution, where there are scores of millions of people who are doing quite all right and who could be asked to contribute more to the public enterprise. But that would be real heavy political lifting rather than trying to persuade the majority to tax the 1% more heavily.
I so agree with that. I think that's so important. And as I become more affluent, not in a super way, but in a noticeable way.
I'm glad you're my friend, Harold. I'm glad I've got some place to go for a loan if it gets to that. But go on, you were saying.
Your sense of shared fate with other people starts to attenuate subtly. So, for example, when I think about my retirement, I think about my 401k and what's happening. I don't really think about Social Security in the same way. So when someone says, if this entitlement crisis, we really should slow the growth of Social Security, I look at that. Of course, I've got a pretty fun job. I sort of look at that and I see I can do that when I'm 75. I look at that and I say, well, that's kind of reasonable. I'm not in the position of somebody at the median of the income distribution who doesn't have a lot of retirement savings, for whom social insurance is the major way that he's going to pay for his retirement. And
his back is killing him. Back is killing him or her at the age of 68 because they've been bending over picking something up for 40 years.
Yeah, and then I can say, hey, he's like one of those guys going on disability with a marginal claim. It gives me a sense of psychological distance and difference in practical interest from a lot of people that are more in need than I am. I want to come back to Trump, which you asked about Trump as well. Yeah. One of the things that is most concerning to me about Trump's law and order rhetoric is, there's been this growing bipartisan consensus and you talked to Steve Tellis, who's so eloquent about this, that there are people like Newt Gingrich and the Koch brothers, and there's people on the right who genuinely want to reduce mass incarceration. There's a hunger to find some way to reduce the high number of Americans that are locked up and to be more humane towards people who have violated our laws and who require some kind of criminal justice response, but a less brutal one than we often give. And I worry that the current polarizing way that Trump is framing the debate will make it much harder for people on the Republican and conservative side of the aisle to continue what they're doing, where they've actually made real progress in Texas and Mississippi and lots of states in the South, to really try to improve the criminal justice system.
I'm going to make a prediction. I predict that before too long, before we get well into October, Trump will be giving a speech in which he clarifies his position, because there is an inconsistency between, on the one hand, his effort to appeal to the black community for their vote. I can fix it. Don't worry, your community's in trouble. I can fix it. On the one hand, and his pro-police moves, where he's trying to get himself kind of on the other side from Black Lives Matter and behind the Fraternal Order of the Brothers of the Police in the political. There's kind of a tension there, and it would be very easy for him to say, "Look, I think that the Koch brothers and Newt Gingrich and these other people, the right on crime people, are right. There are too many people in prison. That has become oppressive. I want order on the streets, but my solution to that does not have to be doubling down on 2.25 million people under lock and key on a given day." And then he could elaborate on that. And that, there's some smart people. I mean, Kellyanne Conway is not a fool. That's a very easy move, it seems to me, for him to make. So I'm predicting that. I don't know. We'll see.
By the way, one point that I think is so interesting in this current debate is the role of political signaling games in a variety of ways in this whole campaign. I mean, Trump is not competing for black votes at all. It's obvious to everybody that he's going to get, if he gets 4% of the African American vote, that's really, he's doing well. And the entire exercise is to reach more moderate white people who don't want to vote for an avowed racist. And this is one example. Another thing is, I thought the discussion of birtherism is so interesting because it was never about any factual dispute. And at one level, you could say, well, Trump was just making the subtext of a lot of Republican rhetoric, the text. He's not the first person to do the dog whistle or whatever. But of course, making the subtext the text is a big deal. And that I am willing to actually. But the whole point is, I'm flouting the conventions of polite conversation and a pluralist democracy, and I'm just going to be out there and say it. I'm going to challenge the president's birth certificate. And whether he actually believed it, whether his listeners believed it, was all secondary. It's really, this is a guy willing to be politically incorrect in the most profound way. And which is part of why it's so silly to even have a discussion with somebody else whispering about this or whatever. It's that he made it the centerpiece of his campaign to signal that where he was positioned.
Okay. I think I agree with both of the things that you said. Certainly on the birtherism thing, the bringing of something from under the covers out into the open is a not trivial move. It's a very big move. It authorizes a different kind of discourse. And on the idea that he's not really interested in helping blacks, he's talking over their heads to white people and trying to influence their votes. I'm not so sure. I guess I'm more willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on the question of sincerity. On the question of political strategy, sure, it's going to be more moderate suburban Republican women outside of Philadelphia, something that he's concerned about. But if he could move 4% to 8% or 10% in a close state like North Carolina or Ohio, it could make a big difference. So I'm not sure he doesn't care at all about how blacks are responding to him. But I think the main audience, as you say, is white. But I want to ask you this. Mm-hmm. Now, you were around, and you and I were around in 1992 when Bill Clinton got elected. Yeah. And I remember Vince Foster. Okay, so Vince Foster was a lawyer who worked in the White House, and he was an aide to Clinton back from Arkansas, and he committed suicide.
Yeah.
And the line was put out that he had been murdered by the Clintons because he knew too much. Okay? Now, the people who were touting that, I can't name them, but they were many. Yeah. In the conservative pundocracy and whatnot. And there were undoubtedly some elected officials who flirted with it, but I can't remember to name any names. Yeah. But it was a widely discussed accusation. Were they not trying to delegitimate the first Arkansas Democrat to be elected to the presidency of the United States? Indeed, they were trying to delegitimate him. Now, the fact that this birther lie about Obama was touted by people for whatever their reasons were, certainly was meant to delegitimate him. But when people talk about it as a racist act intended to delegitimate our first black president of the United States, I have to tell you, I reach for my wallet. I do it every time. Metaphorically speaking, I guard myself against that claim because I think two things have been combined in one. Partisan, ugly, mud-slinging smears, which we know have existed before any black person got elected president, and racial bigotry. Anyway, I'll stop because I'm going to get into trouble with everybody. I'm defending Trump yet again. But I mean, Vince Foster being murdered by people in the White House in some kind of, House of Cards scenario. I mean, come on, that was as low as it gets.
Well, I'll say, let me make a couple of reactions to that. One is, I think that many people on the right will take great pride, assuming we have President Clinton, Hillary Clinton. They will take great pride in demonizing her, and they will use that as a defense against the charge of racism regarding President Obama.
See, we're doing the same thing to her that we did to him.
Yeah, they'll say, look at this crazy stuff we're saying about her. They're not racist.
Okay.
By the way, and so there's no doubt that the hatred of liberals goes very deep. And by the way, there's those on the left that also share that. And It is sort of amazing how it's the animating passion in American politics. It's clear that a lot of people on the right hate liberals more than they hate Putin. And, Putin, as Trump has this weird symbiotic relationship with Putin, that seems less, since liberals and Putin don't get along, that seems to be, Putin can't be all bad. My hope is that after Trump loses, that conservatives, I actually take great, I give a lot of credit to my friends that I tangled with in health policy on the Republican side, on the Libertarian side, conservatives. Not one of the health policy experts that I tangled with is a Trump supporter. And I know a lot of them. And I hope that there's a house cleaning and a realization that, this Vince Foster, the people that were spreading this direct about Vince Foster, Sean Hannity, this entire media ecosystem is so toxic that it has damaged the country and that it has damaged the Republican and conservative movement so deeply that there needs to be a house cleaning. And it needs to really...
Carol, I hear you, man. I'm sorry to interrupt. We're almost out of time, and I got to get this in. I got to get this in. Because you know what this sounds like? I mean, it's an almost isometric isomorphism from the argument that you've just been making now back to a 1950s argument about how the lefties around the labor union movement and around the Democratic Party who were a little bit too sympathetic to the Soviet Union, and I hope there'll be a house cleaning, and I hope after, what was that guy's name who ran in 1948 as a socialist?
Henry Wallace.
Henry Wallace. I hope after Henry Wallace loses that the unions and will purge themselves of all, whatever. I mean, it's an eerie similarity in my mind, and maybe that's only because I know that anything that I might have positive to say about, for example, liking the fact that Trump is calling explicit attention to problems in the inner cities, and whether or not he actually means it, whether or not there's anything he can do, I just like the fact that the rhetoric has changed. But I dare not say so in public because I'm only 68, Harold. I have a long career ahead of me, and I don't want to be blacklisted.
Well, your isomorphism point is totally right if one doesn't pay any attention to what people specifically say and do. And, there's a lot of conservatives who are very partisan Republicans who are also very good people and who are not, who don't talk about birtherism, who aren't supporting Trump, and who really deserve to be disagreed with, but to be treated as honorable participants in the American political debate. And we need a healthy Republican Party. I'm a big believer in the two-party system. And there's people that have been behaving in a way that has damaged the country. And
do you think that Rudy Giuliani,
we have to distinguish them.
Do you think that Rudy Giuliani doesn't deserve to be heard in American public debate? That Newt Gingrich doesn't deserve to be heard? That Chris Christie doesn't deserve to be heard in American public debate? That Ted Cruz doesn't deserve a place at the table when we discuss our future? Because all these people support Trump.
I would say that those people should be thought of and discussed the same way that people who supported segregation and Joe McCarthy should be. It's not that they should be written out of American life, but it should be a paragraph in their obituary, and that it should be a mark on them for the rest of their careers.
The way that Senator Byrd from West Virginia was scarred for the rest of his career about having been a Ku Klux Klan member earlier in his life. Because in fact, he was not scarred.
What's that?
I said because in fact he was not scarred for the rest of his life by that. He was forgiven by that for that.
Well, I think he offered an explanation in a way that, and he changed in a very serious way. And you know,
and you
I
really
believe in
think that
redemption.
support for Trump is equivalent to supporting segregation in the South in the 1950s and 60s?
Yeah, I do actually. I think that obviously segregation was a more evil thing than anything going on in America. But there was a moment of national crisis and of obvious and a person who was obviously malevolent in the body politic. And there was a question: are you going to stand up and oppose this or not? And there were lots of good people who kind of hoped that segregation would end, but didn't stand up, but were willing to support it. There were lots of good people who thought McCarthy went a little too far, but, communism is a problem, etc. And people like William F. Buckley, I think we need to remember them as people who failed the country when the critical moment was at hand. Trump could win the presidency. He's got, a 1/3 chance of winning the presidency.
Exactly.
And these are people who are abetting his efforts.
And what about the people who support him, who are giving money to his campaign, who are working for him, who will weep on election night when he loses? What about them? Are they the deplorables in Hillary Clinton's famous terminology? Have you no sense of civic fellowship with those people? Being part of the same J.D. Vances of the world, etc.
Well, I have two brothers-in-law who are Trump supporters. I think by the way, what I object to when Clinton did was that she spoke about people rather than to them. And I think that people who vote for Trump should be challenged directly, and to say, this is who you're supporting. You are doing something that is profoundly wrong. And you're accountable for that. Now, does that mean that I think that in all ways these are bad people? Do I still love my two brothers-in-law who are doing this? Yes, I do. Do I think that they have human reasons for supporting Trump that need to be thought about, taken seriously? I do. But part of that is to say to them, dude, I love you, but you are really doing something that is very harmful. That would really hurt a lot of people, and you're going to have to. Are you going to somehow explain to your granddaughters that you voted for this guy because Hillary Clinton messed up her email? I mean, it's and I think people need to be directly and respectfully challenged when they are making a profound error of this magnitude.
Well, you say he's got a 1/3 chance of winning, and so. The most likely scenario is the one that you described. But the other one, God, I shudder to think. Suppose he should win, not only for the reasons that you adduce, which is that he'd be a bad president, but also for the sake of the country itself, because I don't know how folks like yourself will ever be able to find common ground with the people who will then be manning and womaning the U.S. government should he become elected. But we shall see. This has been interesting, Harold. I'm thinking of having a pro-Trump person on the Glenn Show to bat these things around. And should you tune in and see that, I don't want you to get the wrong idea, okay? I'm just trying to do a good job here in covering the political landscape. I want to hear from these people to find out what makes them tick.
By the way, just one thing as we close out. I think that Trump's candidacy has made all of the things that you and I probably both are concerned about in the campus left, has made all of that so much worse. Because he confirms every stereotype that my comfortable left of center world among my students and colleagues, what everybody was already too prone to think. And we could have a whole other conversation about how the impact that he has had on the quality of conversation in the university environment is also very toxic in aggravating all the tendencies that you and I complain about on other occasions.
Well, you're making a good point here, because every time I go to try to give, as a devil's advocate, the other side, more conservative side, in a classroom discussion on race and inequality, I realize that I might be sounding like Donald Trump, and I pull back.
Yeah. Yeah.
The legitimacy of even offering that argument, to the extent that it's associated with him in the minds of my students, is absolutely zero.
Yeah.
So that's a
Yeah.
fair point. Thanks a lot for your time, Harold. It's been an interesting discussion, and we'll catch you next time.
That's really
Okay, bye-bye.